What's up, y'all? My name is Dan. So here in this video, I'm going to be talking about WestJet, more specifically about their long-haul flights and their transatlantic destinations for summer 2022, and the aircraft that are going to be flown on these flights, and a few extra interesting details about these routes. WestJet operates their transatlantic flights in a different way than Air Canada or the big US airlines. Unlike these airlines, WestJet began as a low-cost airline, so their business model is very different. Most of their transatlantic flights are summer seasonal flights. The only exceptions are the flights from Calgary to London Gatwick and Paris Charles de Gaulle, and from Toronto to Gatwick. Probably because these flights are the more popular transatlantic flights, with Calgary being the main WestJet hub, and Toronto being a big hub with a lot of demand into London. WestJet's transatlantic flights began in 2014 on a seasonal basis with the Boeing 737-700 between St. John's in Newfoundland and Dublin, Ireland. This flight actually began in Toronto and stopped over in St. John's on its way to Dublin. Glasgow was also later added to the destination list pretty soon with the same aircraft, though I'm not actually sure where they flew to Glasgow, whether it was St. John's or Halifax. But this got the airline started up with the transatlantic flights. Currently, though, the airline doesn't fly transatlantic from St. John anymore. Later on, after getting their 767-300ERs, the airline announced flights to London Gatwick, going into more direct competition against Air Canada, flying from several cities like St. John's, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. Some of these were seasonal, and some had been terminated. WestJet later got their 787s, on which they began their flights from Calgary to Dublin and Paris, and they also got their 737 MAX 8 that they used on flights from Halifax and Toronto. Meanwhile, other flights were added like Barcelona and Rome that began later on. Majority of WestJet's transatlantic flights come out of Toronto Pearson, with a total of 24 flights per week as of August 2022. They got daily flights to London Gatwick and Dublin, as well as daily flights to Scotland, including 3 weekly flights to Edinburgh and 4 to Glasgow. And lastly, 2 weekly flights to Barcelona. These flights get reduced as the summer season ends. The flights to Scotland end on October 2nd, and the Barcelona and Dublin flights end on October 30th. London Gatwick is year-round. While these flights can have a couple of connections from other Canadian and US airports, it seems like for the most part these flights are dependent on just local demand between Toronto and Europe, which might be a reason why most of these might be seasonal. Then there's Calgary, WestJet's main hub, which got 20 weekly flights to Europe, including 5 weekly to London Gatwick and Paris Charles de Gaulle, 4 weekly to London Heathrow, and 3 weekly to Dublin and Rome, all of them being seasonal except London, Gatwick, and Paris. While these flights are fewer than Toronto, Calgary got more seat capacity because of the larger aircraft that WestJet flies from Calgary, with all routes being flown on the 787, whereas from Toronto most routes are on the 737 MAX, and while Toronto's flights are more dependent on local demand, it seems like the Calgary flights are also somewhat dependent on connections from all Western Canada, which is where the airline's routes actually are, and also where WestJet got the most connections. The flights to Paris, Dublin, and Rome also got no competition, which is also an advantage. Halifax got 17 weekly flights to Europe, including daily flights to London Gatwick, 3 weekly to both Dublin and Glasgow, as well as 4 weekly to Paris. All of these are operated with the 737 MAX 8 and mostly with point-to-point seasonal demand, although you can get a few connections as well. And lastly, Vancouver with a daily seasonal flight to London Gatwick that mainly caters towards the summer demand between Vancouver and London. And sure, there's also the connecting demand, but this being such a big market, it makes sense that these flights depend more on local demand, while the Calgary flight can handle a lot of the connecting traffic from Western Canada. WestJet's flights are also very different from Air Canada in the type of fleet that they use for transatlantic flights, that being the 787s and the 737 MAX. And while sure, Air Canada flies the MAX in transatlantic flights, it's to a much lesser extent, only flying to Reykjavik and also between Halifax and London. While Air Canada's 787s are only part of Air Canada's huge wide-body fleet. WestJet uses their 787s for their Calgary and Vancouver flights since they are much longer and busier flights that are too long for the 737 MAX, as well as Toronto to London Gatwick and Barcelona, both of which are very busy routes for WestJet. All the other routes from Toronto to Scotland and Ireland are flown on the 737 MAX 8, as well as all of their Halifax flights are done on the 737 MAX, which makes sense as a lot of these routes are a lot shorter with much lower demand than the 787 flights. Having these aircraft can be a big advantage for WestJet. They're both very flexible aircraft. The 737 MAX can be used for lower demand transatlantic flights during the summer season, while they can be used on shorter routes to the Caribbean and other destinations during the winter season. Same thing applies to the 787, which can be flown to Europe during the summer season, while in the winter they can fly to larger winter destinations in Mexico and the Caribbean, such as Cancun, Punta Cana, Puerto Vallarta, and other destinations, or they can simply just fly them domestically. In summary, the WestJet basically follows the demand into Europe that other airlines might not be able to fill or might not want to fill. But they're also creating demand by adding flights that didn't exist before and attract passengers that might not have flown before by lowering their prices in comparison to Air Canada. WestJet has actually been using this to become Canada's second full service airline, but really WestJet seems to be more like a mix, with some low cost elements to it, such as the lower cost in comparison to Air Canada and also flying mostly to leisure destinations, including a lot of routes that no other airline flies. But WestJet also has some full service elements to it, such as having the Calgary hub and more than one class in their flights, and well, the long haul flights as well. And well, as of now, it seems like WestJet is going to be focusing more on the western side of the country for now, especially since a lot of the demand is more on the leisure side of things at the moment. I'm not sure how much they're going to be expanding in the near future, but since business travel has not recovered from the pandemic, it makes sense for WestJet to focus a lot more on leisure travel, because that's what's booming right now. I'm sure they're going to expand soon in a few years into new markets as demand begins to pick up. But for now, I feel like the transatlantic network will stay as it is for now. And as they get the remaining 77s delivered, they could expand towards more destinations, like making Heathrow year-round, or maybe resuming flights to Amsterdam, and maybe more 737 MAX routes that can be added from Halifax, St. John's, or Toronto. I don't think Asia flights are on the table for the airline, at least not anytime soon, probably because the market between Canada and Asia is a little bit saturated from Vancouver, while Calgary probably doesn't have the demand to have Asia flights since Korean Air canceled their Calgary flights and Air Canada hasn't even resumed theirs. But I guess we'll see how it all goes in the future, because for now, while the existing markets might seem to be quite stable, the future might seem to be a bit uncertain. Thanks for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any comments, questions, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. That's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.